June 10, 1945. A displaced persons camp outside Frankfurt. The afternoon sun cuts through barbed wire fences. Greta Müller watches through the chain link as an American female officer lights a cigarette. In public. In uniform. In broad daylight, the officer takes a long drag, exhales slowly, continues her conversation with a male colleague, as if nothing extraordinary is happening. Greta's hands grip the fence. She's smoking. She whispers to the woman beside her. Out in the open, like a man. In 12 years of Nazi Germany, Greta has never seen a respectable woman smoke publicly. Women who smoked were prostitutes, degenerates, gender traitors. The propaganda was explicit. Smoking masculinized women, corrupted their reproductive capacity, signaled moral decay. Now her captor on enemy officers casually smoking a cigarette while coordinating food distribution. Professional, competent, and utterly unfazed by violating what Greta believed was a fundamental law of feminine propriety. Those words were about to become the first crack in a worldview built on 12 years of Nazi gender ideology. For 8 weeks, Greta and thousands of other German women have been detained while Allied forces sort through the wreckage of the Third Reich. They've been processed, interrogated, categorized. Some are war criminals. Some are collaborators. Most are simply women who lived under the regime, believed its lies, internalized its values. The denazification program has begun. They attend mandatory lectures about concentration camps, about genocide, about the lies they were told. The images are horrifying. The guilt is crushing. But it's not the lectures or the photographs that shake Greta most profoundly. It's watching Allied women American, British, French smoke cigarettes with the same casual confidence German men displayed, as if women's bodies belong to themselves rather than to the state's reproductive agenda. What Greta doesn't know yet is that this simple observation, women smoking publicly without shame, will dismantle her understanding of gender, morality, and female autonomy more completely than any lecture about Nazi crimes ever could. The cognitive dissonance is immediate. Nazi ideology taught that women who smoked were biologically damaged, morally corrupted, betraying their essential feminine nature. But these Allied women are clearly competent, professional, respected by their male colleagues. Either everything she was taught about smoking and femininity was a lie, or these Allied women are secretly degenerate despite their apparent competence. The contradiction can't be resolved without abandoning deeply held beliefs. In Nazi Germany, women's behavior was strictly controlled through biological rhetoric. Women who smoked weren't just breaking social norms, they were supposedly damaging their wombs, poisoning their future children, betraying their sacred duty as mothers of the master race. Now Greta is watching women smoke who seem perfectly healthy, perfectly capable, perfectly respected, and the foundation of Nazi gender ideology is beginning to crack. How did the simple act of watching women smoke become the catalyst that helped thousands of German women recognize the lies they'd been taught about female nature, autonomy, and the relationship between bodies and ideology? To understand Greta's shock, we must go back to 1933, when she was 16 years old, and the Nazis began their systematic campaign to control women as bodies through moral panic about smoking. The Reich Health Office launched the campaign for the smoke-free German woman in March 1933, just 2 months after Hitler took power. The messaging was relentless. Smoking damaged women's reproductive capacity, masculinized their appearance, signaled sexual availability and moral corruption. Dr. Carly Still, director of the Institute for Tobacco Hazards Research in Jena, published widely distributed pamphlets with grotesque illustrations. The Smoking Woman, a threat to the race, showed women with cigarettes morphing into skeletal, masculine creatures with withered wombs. The caption read, "Every cigarette steals life from your future children." Greta saw these posters everywhere. At school, in shops, on street corners. The message was inescapable. Good German women don't smoke. Only degenerates smoke. Only traitors to the race smoke. In 1935, at age 18, Greta joined the League of German Girls Not Optional for young women seeking employment or education. The indoctrination was explicit. Her group leader, Frau Hoffmann, lectured weekly on proper feminine behavior. Smoking is masculine behavior, Hoffman told them. When women smoke, they betray their biological purpose. They damage the eggs in their ovaries. They poison the future generation. A woman with a cigarette is a woman who has chosen selfishness over motherhood, degeneracy over duty. The girls nodded. Greta believed completely. She'd seen the science, or what was presented as science. She'd seen the photographs of degenerate women in Weimar, Berlin, smoking in nightclubs, their faces hard and masculine. When her older sister Helene secretly smoked in 1936, Greta reported her to their mother. Helene was sent to a re-education program for 6 weeks. She never forgave Greta, but Greta felt righteous. She'd protected her sister from self-destruction. What German women didn't know was that the anti-smoking campaign was never really about health. It was about control. The Nazis had studied Soviet propaganda techniques and borrowed heavily. Control women's bodies by controlling their behavior. Frame bodily autonomy as racial betrayal. Make every personal choice a political act. Eliminate privacy by making everything what you eat, what you wear, what you smoke a matter of state interest. Smoking was chosen as a target because it was visible, gendered, and could be framed as threatening reproduction. Women who smoked were exercising bodily autonomy, choosing pleasure over prescribed purpose. In Nazi ideology, that was intolerable. The campaign was remarkably successful. By 1939, fewer than 8% of German women smoked, down from nearly 30% in 1930. The social stigma was overwhelming. Women who smoked in public faced harassment, job loss, social ostracism. But it wasn't just negative reinforcement. The Nazis also celebrated natural femininity, women who embraced their reproductive purpose, who maintained traditional appearance, who subordinated personal desires to racial duty. These women were praised, promoted, given awards and recognition. Greta embraced this ideology completely. She never smoked. She judged women who did. She believed she was protecting both herself and her nation by maintaining proper feminine behavior. This wasn't just about smoking, it was about constructing a model of femininity that served totalitarian purposes. Women who internalized Nazi gender norms became controlling their own bodies and judging other women, freeing the state from constant surveillance. By 1939, Greta was married, pregnant, and completely devoted to Nazi ideals of motherhood. She had 2 daughters by 1943. She raised them with the same gender. Ideology, she-de, internalized smoking, is degenerate. Feminine virtue is obedience. Women's bodies exist for reproductive purposes. The war years intensified everything. Women were needed in factories, in offices, in roles traditionally male. But the ideology didn't change. Women working was temporary necessity, not permanent evolution. When the war ended, women would return to domestic roles. This was stated policy, repeated endlessly. Greta worked in a munitions factory from 1943 to 1945. She never smoked, even when male co-workers offered cigarettes during breaks. "I'm not that kind of woman," she would say proudly. What Greta didn't know was that in Allied countries, women's smoking rates had actually increased during the war. Women in factories, in military service, in high-stress roles had taken up smoking at higher rates than ever before. And rather than being stigmatized, they were often celebrated as symbols of women's contribution to the war effort. The cultural gap was enormous. By 1945, approximately 40% of British women smoked, 35% of American women, 30% of French women. In Germany, still fewer than 10%, and those who did smoked secretly, shamefully, aware of the social cost. When Allied forces occupied Germany and German women encountered Allied women for the first time, the culture shock was profound and immediate, and nowhere was it more visible than in attitudes toward women smoking. And then, on June 10, 1945, Greta watched that American officer light a cigarette, and everything she'd been taught about women's bodies and behavior began to unravel. The American officer's name is Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell. She's 28 years old, a logistics coordinator from Ohio. She's been in Europe for 14 months. She lights her cigarette without thinking about it. It's habit, estrés, relief, something she does 20 times a day. She doesn't notice the German women staring, doesn't realize her casual act is revolutionary to them. Greta can't look away. Mitchell smokes while working, while talking to male officers, while making decisions that affect thousands of people. The smoking doesn't impair her competence, doesn't make her seem masculine or degenerate. She's just smoking. Another American woman, a Purchisa Red Cross worker named Helen Ford. She asks Mitchell for a light. Mitchell shares her cigarette. They laugh about something. Two professional women, smoking together, utterly unself-conscious. Greta had been taught this was impossible. Women who smoked together were forming bonds of degeneracy, reinforcing each other's moral corruption. But Mitchell and Ford seemed like colleagues, friends, normal women doing normal things. The sensory details are overwhelming. The smell of American cigarettes different from German tobacco. Sweeter somehow. The casual way they hold cigarettes, not hidden, not ashamed, just relaxed. The way male soldiers pass without comment, without judgment, treating it as unremarkable. An older German woman, Frau Weber, speaks what many are thinking. They have no shame, no dignity. This is what happens when women reject their natural roles. They become like men, rough, coarse, unfeminine. But Greta notices something that contradicts Weber's certainty. Lieutenant Mitchell is wearing lipstick, has carefully styled hair, wears her uniform well. She's feminine and smoking simultaneously. The categories Nazi ideology insisted were mutually exclusive are coexisting in one person. That afternoon, a British female officer comes to give one of the mandatory denazification lectures. Captain Elizabeth Crawford, Oxford-educated, articulate, commanding. She's explaining Allied principles of governance, of human rights, of individual liberty, and midway through the lecture, she pauses to light a cigarette. The German women react with visible shock. Some whisper, some look Hawaii. Some seem almost offended that this educated, articulate, clearly intelligent woman would damage herself with tobacco. Crawford notices. She takes a long drag, exhales, and addresses it directly. I see some of you are disturbed that I smoke, she says in careful German. In your country, you were taught that women who smoke are degenerate. Yes, that we damage our wombs, betray our feminine nature. Uncomfortable nods. This was a lie told to control you, Crawford continues. Not a health recommendation, a tool of control. In my country, women smoke or don't smoke, based on personal choice. It has nothing to do with our worth, our femininity, our capability. This is what freedom looks like, making choices about your own body without state intervention. The words land like grenades. Greta feels something shifting inside her. Not just about smoking, about everything. If the smoking prohibition was about control rather than biology, what else was a lie? What other aspects of Nazi gender ideology were tools of manipulation rather than natural laws? This wasn't an isolated incident. Across occupied Germany, in Frankfurt, Munich, Berlin, Hamburg-Uther, German women were discovering the same destabilizing truth. In Berlin, Marguerite Koch watched a French female officer smoke while directing traffic. The officer was commanding, respected, and utterly unconcerned about feminine propriety. Marguerite had spent 12 years believing women who smoked became masculine and incapable. The evidence before her eyes contradicted everything. In Munich, Anna Schneider saw a group of American female soldiers on leave, smoking and laughing in a beer garden. They wore civilian clothes, looked feminine, seemed happy. The image of smoking as linked to misery and moral decay didn't match reality. In Hamburg, Liselle Brown encountered a female British doctor who smoked while treating patients. The doctor was competent, compassionate, and clearly healthy, despite years of smoking. The propaganda about smoking destroying women's health seemed suddenly suspect. They expected Allied women to be either non-smokers respectable or secret smokers ashamed. They found women who smoked openly, without guilt, without apparent physical or moral degradation. They had been told smoking masculinized women and made them unfit for feminine roles. The truth was that Allied women smoked and remained demonstrably feminine, capable, and respected. The Allied occupation authorities hadn't specifically planned to use smoking as a tool of but they quickly recognized its psychological impact. The infrastructure of difference was visible everywhere. While German culture had spent 12 years stigmatizing female smoking as racial betrayal, Allied cultures had normalized it as personal choice and even wartime patriotism. Compare the numbers. By 1945, German women's smoking rate was under 10%. American women's rate was 35%. British women's rate was 40%. The gap wasn't just statistical, it was ideological. The Allies had abundant tobacco supplies as part of standard military rations. Easily procured, widely distributed, German civilians had almost none. Cigarettes became currency in the post-war black market. The material abundance of the victors was symbolized by their casual smoking. What seemed like individual choices by Allied women to smoke publicly was actually revealing a fundamental philosophical difference. Allied gender ideology imperfect, as it was allowed women more bodily autonomy. Nazi gender ideology had subordinated women's bodies entirely to state reproductive interests. The human faces within the system made the contrast stark. Lieutenant Sarah Michel, the officer Greta first watched smoking, had grown up in a working-class Ohio family. Her mother had smoked. Her aunts had smoked. Female smoking was normal, unremarkable, not linked to moral worth. I didn't even think about it. Micho later recalled in an interview. I'd smoke during work breaks, same as my male colleagues. The German women would stare like I was doing something scandalous. It took me weeks to understand why. Captain Elizabeth Crawford, the British officer who addressed smoking directly in her lecture, was more deliberate. She'd been briefed on Nazi gender ideology before deployment. She understood that challenging those beliefs was crucial to I made a point of smoking during lectures, she explained in her memoirs, not to shock them, but to demonstrate that their beliefs about women's nature were constructed, not biological. If I could be educated, competent, and feminine while smoking, then everything they'd been taught about smoking and femininity was demonstrably false. Dr. Ruth Goldman, a German Jewish refugee who returned to Germany as part of the American denazification program, had the most complex position. She'd fled Germany in 1938 after her family was targeted. She'd watched from abroad as Nazi gender ideology had stripped German women of autonomy, while convincing them it was for their own good. The smoking prohibition was brilliant propaganda, she wrote in a 1947 report. It made women believe the state was protecting them, while actually controlling them. It framed bodily autonomy as racial betrayal. Every woman who internalized the prohibition became an agent of surveillance over other women. It was totalitarian control disguised as health policy and feminine virtue. What seemed like random cultural differences in smoking norms was actually revealing the extent to which Nazi ideology had colonized German women's understanding of their own bodies. The smoking gap was really a bodily autonomy gap, a freedom gap, an ideology gap. The system had disturbing effectiveness. Some German women who witnessed Allied women smoking responded not with curiosity but with disgust. They de-internalized Nazi ideology so completely that evidence contradicting it was rejected as proof of Allied moral decay rather than evidence. Their beliefs might be wrong, but younger women under 30 who had been children when the Nazis took power, were more susceptible to cognitive dissonance. They'd been indoctrinated but hadn't chosen the ideology. For them, watching Allied women smoke planted seeds of doubt that would grow into questions, then into transformations. Most surprising were the German women who had secretly smoked during the Nazi years, risking social ostracism, hiding their behavior, living with shame. Suddenly, they were encountering Allied women who smoked without shame, without consequence, without apparent moral or physical degradation. For these women, the revelation was profound. Their secretive, shameful behavior was normalized, accepted, even unremarkable in Allied cultures. What they'd believed was their personal failing was actually just a choice that their culture had performed. The question became, if the smoking prohibition was based on lies, what other Nazi gender ideology was built on manipulation rather than truth? 3 weeks after watching Lieutenant Mitchell smoke that first cigarette, Greta faces an impossible choice that has nothing to do with tobacco and everything to do with identity. An Allied re-education officer, Major Helen Chambers, is recruiting German women for a civic leadership training program. The program will teach democratic principles, prepare women for participation in rebuilding German civil society, offer pathways to employment and education. Greta wants to participate. She needs work. Her husband is missing, possibly dead. She has 2 daughters to support. The program offers real opportunity. But there's a catch, or what she perceives as a catch. At the informational meeting, Major Chambers smokes throughout her presentation, and several German women who've already joined the program are smoking too. Not all of them, but some. Publicly, without shame. Greta realizes that joining this program means entering a space where smoking is normalized, where women exercising bodily autonomy is accepted, where she'd be surrounded by behavior she was taught to see as degenerate. She sits outside Major Chambers' office. The choice should be simple. She needs the work, wants the training. But accepting it feels like betraying everything she believed about proper feminine behavior. Frau Weber finds her there. Weber, older and more rigid, speaks what Greta is thinking. Don't do it. These programs corrupt German women. They teach American values selfishness, masculine behavior, abandonment of proper feminine roles. If you join, you'll become like them. But Lieutenant Schneider, a younger German woman who's already in the program, overhears. She sits down beside Greta. I was terrified too, Schneider admits. I'd been taught smoking was degenerate, that women who smoked were betraying the race. But then I thought, what if that was a lie? What if controlling our bodies was never about protecting us, but about controlling us? She pulls out a cigarette. American. Offered by one of the instructors. I don't have to smoke, Schneider says. Nobody requires it. But I can smoke if I choose. That's the difference. That's what they took from Mazda. Ability to choose for ourselves. The smoking prohibition was never about health. It was about making us police our own bodies. So the state didn't have to. She lights the cigarette, takes a drag, doesn't transform into the masculine, degenerate creature the propaganda promised. I'm still a good mother, Schneider continues. Still feminist, still capable of all the things I was before. But now I get to decide what I do with my own body. That's not degeneracy. That's freedom. Greta watches the smoke curl upward. 12 years of ideology warring with 3 weeks of contradictory evidence. That evening, she joins the program. She doesn't smoke, not yet. Maybe not ever. But she enters a space where other women smoke without consequence. And in doing so, she takes the first step toward recognizing that her body might belong to herself rather than to state ideology. The moment of cognitive dissonance is visceral. Captain Crawford addresses it in one of her early sessions with the program participants. Some of you are disturbed by women smoking, she says directly. You were taught it's immoral, biologically damaging, a betrayal of feminine nature. I want you to consider, why were you taught this? Who benefited from controlling your behavior? What happened to women who violated these norms? The questions crack something open. Greta remembers her sister Helene, sent to re-education for smoking. Remembers the humiliation, the surveillance, the way every woman became an enforcer of norms against other women. You weren't protecting yourselves, Crawford continues. You were being controlled, and you were turned into instruments of control over each other. That's how totalitarian ideology works. Makes the oppressed enforce their own oppression. Another participant, Frau Richter, pushes back. But the health risks the damaged wombs. The poisoned children, those were real. Crawford nods. Smoking does have health risks, but so does stress, malnutrition, industrial work, childbirth. Why was smoking uniquely stigmatized for women, while men's smoking was accepted? Because it was never just about health. It was about control. The conversation continues for hours. Some women resist, some begin questioning. Some, like Greta, exist in painful liminal space between old certainty and new doubts. 6 months ago, Greta would have reported any woman she saw smoking to authorities. Now, she sits in rooms with women who smoke and participates in their programs. The transformation isn't complete, but it's begun. But this knowledge comes with a price. Guilt for having judged other women, anger at having been manipulated, grief for her sister Helene, whom she betrayed, fear of what else she believed that might be lies, and the terrifying question, If they lied about this, what else did they lie about? If women's bodies don't belong to the state, what other Nazi ideology falls apart? The pattern replicated across occupied Germany, creating thousands of individual transformations that would collectively reshape German women's relationship with autonomy, femininity, and state power. In Frankfurt, Margrethe Koch joined a women's discussion group led by an American Quaker relief worker named Dorothy Martin. Martin smoked pipe tobacco even more shocking than cigarettes. But she was also compassionate, intelligent, and deeply committed to helping German women rebuild their lives. We would meet weekly to discuss democratic principles, Marguerite wrote in her diary, and Dorothy would smoke her pipe throughout. At first, I was horrified, but gradually, I realized the smoking didn't diminish her wisdom or compassion. It was just something she did. The connection between smoking and moral worth that I'd believed my entire adult life simply was unreal. The discussions evolved. Women began sharing their experiences of Nazi gender ideology, the ways they'd been controlled, the fears they'd internalized, the shame they carried for behaviors the regime had In Munich, Anna Schneider encountered a female French officer who offered her a cigarette during a break from denazification classes. Anna had never smoked. The offer itself was shocking, a suggestion that she might try behavior she'd been taught was forbidden. I said no, Anna recalled in a 1960 interview, but the fact that she offered, casually, as equals that changed something. She wasn't trying to corrupt me. She was treating me like an autonomous adult capable of making my own choices. I'd never been treated that way before. 3 months later, Anna tried smoking. Not because I wanted to smoke particularly, she explained, but because I wanted to prove to myself that I could make choices about my own body, that the state didn't know me anymore. In Berlin, Liesel Braun had a more complicated experience. She'd secretly smoked throughout the Nazi years, hiding her behavior, carrying shame. When she encountered British women smoking openly, her first emotion was anger. I'd suffered for this behavior, she wrote, lost job opportunities, faced social ostracism, lived with constant shame, and these British women just smoked. Casually, without consequence. It felt unfair. But the anger transformed into recognition. I realized my suffering was unnecessary, artificially imposed. The shame I carried was a weapon used against me. These British women weren't immoral for smoking. Openly, I'd been oppressed for being forced to hide it. Not everyone welcomed transformation. In Hamburg, a group of older German women organized opposition to what they called Allied moral corruption, led by Frau Gertrude Hofminde. Same woman who had taught Greta's League of German Girls group in the 1930s. They advocated for maintaining traditional German feminine values. These Allied women are trying to corrupt us, Hoffman wrote in a widely circulated letter. They smoke, they drink, they behave like men. They want German women to abandon our virtue, our dedication to motherhood, our proper feminine roles. We must resist this cultural poisoning. Her rhetoric found audience among women who had invested deeply in Nazi gender ideology, who had built identities around being proper German women, who couldn't accept that their sacrifices might have been based on lies. For some women, the price of recognizing the truth was too high. It meant admitting they'd judged other women unjustly, enforced oppression, internalized propaganda. Easier to maintain the ideology than accept complicity. Private Hildebecker, who had reported multiple women for smoking during the Nazi years, couldn't reconcile watching Allied women smoke. They're degenerates, she insisted to anyone who would listen. You'll see their children will be damaged. Their bodies will fail. The propaganda was true. They're just too corrupted to realize it yet. She maintained this belief until her death in 1983. Despite decades of evidence that women who smoked weren't experiencing the biological catastrophes Nazi propaganda had promised, but thousands of younger women embraced transformation. By December 1945, Allied reports noted significant increases in German women's smoking rates, particularly among women under 30 in occupied zones with high Allied presence. The smoking itself wasn't the point. What mattered was that German women were beginning to make choices about their own bodies, independent of state ideology. They were reclaiming autonomy that had been systematically stripped away. American observers documented the psychological shift. One report from January 1946 noted German women who participate in re-education programs increasingly display autonomous decision-making regarding personal behavior. Smoking rates have increased among younger participants. More significantly, they show reduced deference to male authority and increased willingness to question traditional gender norms. The correlation between exposure to Allied women's behavior and erosion of Nazi gender ideology is measurable and significant. Whether this was successful denazification or cultural imperialism remained debatable. Probably it was both, but the transformation was undeniable. But the real opposition came not just from individual German women, but from German male leadership trying to reassert control in the post-war chaos. Conservative German political leaders, even those cleared of war crimes, saw Allied women's behavior as a threat to restoring traditional German society. They framed women's changing behavior including increased smoking as evidence of occupation corrupting German culture. Konrad Adenauer, who would become West Germany's first chancellor, spoke carefully, but clearly about the need to restore German family values and protect German women from foreign influence. The subtext was obvious. Women needed to return to traditional roles, traditional behavior, traditional subordination. Journalist Friedrich Seeberg wrote an influential essay in 1946, The Cigarette and the Collapse of German Womanhood. He argued that Allied occupation was systematically destroying German feminine virtue by encouraging behaviors like smoking, drinking, and sexual freedom. Our women are being corrupted, he wrote. They see American and British women smoking, behaving like men, and they imitate this degeneracy. This is not, Liberaschnitt, is the destruction of everything that made German women admirable. If we lose our women's virtue, we lose our culture entirely. The rhetoric was effective because it connected multiple anxieties: defeat, occupation, loss of male authority, changing gender roles. Smoking became a visible symbol of everything traditional German men feared about women's liberation. Even moderate voices expressed concern. Pastor Martin Niemöller, an anti-Nazi resistance figure, worried publicly about excessive Americanization of German culture, specifically mentioning women's changing behavior as concerning. The opposition had real power in areas with less direct Allied control. German local authorities passed ordinances restricting women's public smoking, framed as protecting public morals during Reconstruction. Women who smoked publicly in these areas faced harassment, job discrimination, social ostracism. Some German men became violent. Reports from 1946 to 1947 document assaults on German women seen smoking in public, particularly in rural areas. The attacks were framed as protecting German honor from Allied corruption. But something unexpected happened. German women who had experienced the Allied occupation began defending each other. In one documented incident in Frankfurt, a German woman was being harassed by German men for smoking in public. 3 other German women participants in Allied re-education programs intervened. She can smoke if she chooses, one told the men. Her body is hers, not yours to control. The men backed down, shocked that German women would defend such degenerate behavior. The ideological battle was shifting. It was no longer just Germans versus Allies. It was becoming German women who de-experienced liberation versus German men and some women who wanted to restore traditional control. The turning point came in early 1947 when German women's organizations began forming independent of both Allied oversight and German male leadership. These organizations explicitly defended women's rights to bodily autonomy, including the right to smoke, drink, work, dress, and behave as they chose. The Frankfurt Women's Declaration of March 1947 included this statement: "We reject the notion that women's bodies exist for state purposes or male control. This is not degeneracy. This is freedom." The declaration was signed by over 2,000 German women. Many were former participants in Allied re-education programs. Many had never smoked and had no intention of starting boot. They defended other women's right to choose. Even some respected German figures began shifting positions. Philosopher Hannah Arendt, returning to Germany for the first time since fleeing the Nazis, observed, The smoking question reveals everything. Nazi ideology controlled women by convincing them that bodily autonomy was racial betrayal. Now, watching Allied women smoke reveals the lie. The resistance to this revelation shows how deeply the ideology remains embedded. The battle wasn't won quickly. Throughout the late 1940s and into the 1950s, German women who smoked publicly faced judgment, harassment, and discrimination. But the ideological foundation had cracked. The absolute certainty that smoking was moral degradation had been undermined by lived experience of Allied women who smoked without apparent degradation. Reality was winning over ideology. Slowly, incompletely, but inexorably. More significantly, the ideological framework that had justified controlling women's bodies had been substantially dismantled. The biological rhetoric that claimed women's choices about their bodies threatened racial survival had been revealed as propaganda. The social infrastructure that enforced these norms through surveillance and shame had been challenged. The real heirs of this transformation were the daughters born in the late 1940s and 1950s. They grew up with mothers who had experienced both Nazi control and Allied liberation. They inherited a critical perspective on any ideology that claimed to define women's proper behavior. These daughters became the second-wave feminists of the 1960s and 70s. They fought for reproductive rights, workplace equality, sexual freedom. Every battle they fought traced partial lineage to women who learned it through the simple observation of Allied women smoking that bodily autonomy was a right, not a privilege granted by the state. The cost was generational trauma. Many women who'd lived through Nazi indoctrination carried permanent psychological scars. Some never fully trusted their own judgment again, always wondering what else they believed might be lies. Some lived with crippling guilt for having enforced ideology against other women, but the gain was measurable liberation. Women gained legal equality, expanded autonomy, social acceptance for making choices about their own body. The transformation was incomplete. Sexism persisted. Gender discrimination continued. Perfect equality remained elusive, but the foundation had shifted. The idea that women's bodies belonged to the state, that personal choices were political betrayals, that autonomy was degeneracy, these Nazi concepts had been substantially dismantled. Today, there is a small exhibit at the German Women's Archive in Berlin dedicated to Nazi gender ideology and its dismantling. Among the artifacts, propaganda posters warning against female smoking, testimonies from women who experienced both Nazi control and Allied liberation, and photographs of Allied women soldiers smoking in occupied Germany. One display includes a quote from Greta Müller, recorded shortly before her death in 1992. That American officer smokes so casually saved me, not from physical danger, but from ideological prison. It showed me that everything I'd been taught about women's nature was a lie designed to control me. Once I saw that, I couldn't unsee it. The cage dissolved, and I was finally free. June 10th, 1945. A displaced persons camp outside Frankfurt. An American officer lighting a cigarette. That moment, 75 years ago, set in motion a transformation that helped reshape how an entire generation of German women understood autonomy, femininity, and the relationship between bodies and state power. This wasn't just about smoking. It was about the moment when totalitarian ideology about women's bodies encountered living proof of alternatives. When German women who'd been convinced that bodily autonomy was racial betrayal saw Allied women exercising autonomy without apparent moral or physical degradation. The thematic truth. Authoritarian systems often control people by convincing them that control is protection, that restrictions on autonomy serve higher purposes: racial survival, moral purity, social order. The smoking prohibition wasn't about health. It was about establishing precedent that women's bodies belonged to the state. Where did they end up? Greta Müller became a civic educator who taught thousands of women to recognize authoritarian control. Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell returned to Ohio, worked as a logistics manager for 30 years, never realized the profound impact her casual smoking had on German women. Captain Elizabeth Crawford became a professor of international relations, wrote extensively about denazification, always emphasized the importance of bodily autonomy in resisting totalitarianism. Eline Moulet, Greta Sista, died without reconciliation. one of countless women who suffered under Nazi gender ideology. Not everyone transformed. Some German women maintained Nazi beliefs about proper feminine behavior for decades. Some passed those beliefs to others. Some never accepted that they'd been manipulated. This wasn't just about German women, an Allied occupation. It was about what happens when people encounter lived evidence that contradicts totalitarian ideology. About how simple observations, women smoking without consequence, can crack open belief systems that seemed unshakable. About how bodily autonomy is always political, always contested, always worth defending. Few know that several German women who experienced this transformation maintained correspondence for decades with the Allied women they de-observed. They wrote about freedom, about autonomy, about the strange experience of learning liberation from former enemies. The physical legacy exists in laws protecting bodily autonomy, in social norms that accept women's choices about their body, in institutional resistance to any ideology that claims biological justification for controlling women. The psychological legacy runs deeper. Generations of German women who understand that when someone claims to protect you by controlling you, they're probably just controlling you. In a world where women's bodily autonomy remains contested, where reproductive rights, sexual freedom, and personal choices are still framed as threats to social order, this story reminds us that these battles are new, that authoritarian systems have always tried to control bodies through ideology, that the rhetoric changes, but the goal remains the same. Convince people their autonomy threatens something larger, make them police themselves and each other. Greta would later write, "I spent 12 years believing my body belonged to the state, that my choices about what I did with it could betray my race, damage my children, corrupt my society. Then I watched a woman smoke a cigarette and remain human. That simple observation destroyed an entire ideology." Sometimes truth is that simple. You just have to be willing to see it. The lesson wasn't just about smoking or Germany or the 1940s. It was that bodily autonomy is fundamental to human dignity, that any system claiming to protect people by controlling their bodies is lying, that the right to make choices about your own body, whether to smoke, what to eat, how to dress, whether to reproduce, is the foundation of all other rights. The final image: a woman's hand lighting a cigarette in public, casual, unremarkable, revolutionary. Because sometimes revolution isn't dramatic. Sometimes it's just doing something you were told would destroy you and discovering you remain whole. Sometimes it's watching someone else do that thing and realizing the catastrophe you were promised never arrives. Sometimes the most powerful act of resistance is simply claiming the right to exist in your body on your own terms. To make choices others insist you're incapable of making responsibly. To refuse the false protection of control. The cigarette wasn't the point. The autonomy was the point. The choice was the point. The recognition that your body belongs to you, that simple, radical, essential truth, that was the point. And once you see it, once you really understand it, you can never quite accept control again. The cage becomes visible, the manipulation becomes obvious, the lies become transparent, and you're finally free.